Cool, so yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about graphic design. And the reason for that is that I think that the web currently is ready for doing great graphic design stuff. I'm very happy to be back in Utrecht. I used to live here. I studied at the university, which looked like this. If you've seen that in the center, if you've been walking around. But I was in a building that looked like this, which is just outside of town, like a 10-minute bus ride. I'm Hidde. I'm a front-end dev, like the introduction already said. So I work at Mozilla as a contractor, where I work on identity and access management, which has very little to do with CSS. But that's fine. We can talk about that in the break, I suppose. Graphic design and the web, that's what I will be talking about today. And the reason for that is that I saw this tweet by Fantasy a couple of years ago where she introduced this idea of doing a workshop where you would talk about grid layout, about the specification for grid layout. It wasn't the type of workshop where someone would teach you how this stuff works, but it would be talking about the specification together and trying to figure out how this works and maybe find bugs in the specification, make the whole thing better. So I really liked that. We did this in Amsterdam with a couple of people. Went through that long spec. It was a super warm day in June, I think. But when I was going back in the train, I kind of felt like it's so cool that we can do all these things on the web, but now we really need to learn more than just the CSS. We need to learn more about web design, graphic design. So I started to learn a bit more about graphic design. I had a couple of books at home and I bought a few more. And I also looked back at some of the books that I used to learn web development from. So some of you might remember these books. They kind of taught us to do graphic design-y things with tools that didn't really exist in browsers yet. So there were no graphic design tools in browsers as such. A lot of them were hacky. So we had to kind of find our way around how the web works and kind of do weird things, weird hacky things to do stuff like rounded corners, shadows, that sort of thing. Which is great. We were able to do that kind of stuff at the time, but not with web standards that were already built into browsers and were natively doing layout stuff. So yeah, I think it's a new era for layout and design on the web, and the reason for that is that we now have stuff that is built into browsers that we can use for layout. So what do I mean by great graphic design? It's a little bit of a weird term, I guess. It's great is very subjective. But what I specifically want to talk about is modernist web graphic design. And the reason for that is one, that modernism is kind of rule-based, which really matches what we do on the web and with computers. But also because modernism is a movement in not only in art, but also in graphic design that is a response to industrialization. So we've got a whole lot more machines around us, and we needed like an aesthetic that would match machines and this new reality. Some people wrote about this. Jan Giecold is one very famous graphic designer who wrote about modernism and how to make new typography work. And for him, that was a response to what he called the old typography. And that was stuff like books where everything was illustrated beautifully and columns were all equal sizes. And for him, it was sort of time for a new typography that was better. And the reason for that was, he said, we have so much printed stuff in our hands these days. And that was in 1928. So he's probably talking about newspapers, books, those kind of things. And he felt like we needed to focus on readability and on clarity, making things easier to read, because there's a competition between all these publications that people could read. Well, in 2018, I think we definitely have a whole lot of stuff to read. We look at screens most of our days, and if we're not, we might be looking at magazines and TV and all these sorts of things. So there's a whole lot more competition now for our eyes. So clarity, I think, is more important now, still important. So one of the things he did was suggesting that we should do asymmetric alignment. So as you see in this example, these things aren't the same size and they aren't the same width. And the reason for that is that it kind of helps you to have focus in the design. It aids readability because it lets you, it takes your eyes across the design basically. And that's what we see in this example as well. So he takes your eyes around the page. He uses some color as well to really take you to different parts of this design. Another thing that Chico talked about was so being very determined and fresh when you look at new design problems. And what I take from that is that it doesn't really work if we just do the same thing for every design, which some design systems on the web, I won't name names, but some of them do that. And that's something that Chico talked about. We need to be fresh and determined, solve the problem when we arrive at it. So another great graphic designer was Joseph Müller-Brockmann. Many years later, he wrote this book about grid systems, which is one of the ways you can get more clarity and more readability. And he wrote about how to make grid systems and also what they were for. So grids, according to him, were good because we could do more functional and more logical layouts, but also because they were more pretty. They would give us more visually interesting layouts, basically. And for him, if you have a bunch of content and you need to lay it out on a page, it's just a whole lot easier if you can do that on a grid. So if you have a grid, which is basically a number of lines that cross each other, horizontal and vertical lines, you have some kind of help with making these design choices that you have. I can't really go into exactly how to design grids because that's probably a talk on its own or a whole week of talks. But one thing that he does is talk about grid fields. And grid fields is basically dividing the page into fields. So he would go for like 12 or 24 or 32 even, and then base your designs on that. And also Müller-Brockmann talked about this thing of solving problems when they arrive. Rather than having the same solution for everything, it's making intentional choices about what you want to do, what you want to design. So to do that, you need to have a very flexible system. He also liked using mathematics. That also shows in the book of Chico, by the way. He uses proportions, so he makes decisions about numbers, and some things have specific ratios between these different parts in the page. So this is another example of that. So proportions were important for that. These people really believed in having ratios between things. So stuff like the golden ratio were things that were being used. People have opinions about it. I have opinions about that, but that's kind of what they did. So when I talk about modernist graphic design, I shouldn't forget to talk about Wim, who's a Dutch graphic designer and one of the great modernists in this country, and definitely one of the people that got grids working here. So one thing that he is responsible for is this typeface that he called the new alphabet, and that was a response to industrialization, I suppose, or to the modern times, because we had screens with rasters on them. So basically everything on that screen was built out of squares. And if you want to make a beautiful font with round shapes and things, but you make them out of squares, it's not going to look very pretty. So he came up with a new aesthetic that would kind of work for this new reality where we only have squares. So he made this font that is kind of made out of grids. It's incredibly hard to read. This says new alphabet, and especially the W and the A, they are difficult to read. But yeah, that's what he came up with. He's done lots of very interesting posters which have intentional use of whitespace and beautiful typography, lots of illustration. Some of them he designed his own fonts for. For example, the Hiroshima font is one of the fonts that he's designed specifically for this poster. Probably get out of the way a little. And this font is still being used. So when I was looking through Vrij Nederland, the Dutch magazine, a couple of months ago, they had redesigned, and they actually used this font by Wim Krauwel, and they credit them for it. So it has the author, the photographer, and the typographer, which is not very common, but for this case, they did that. But it wasn't just beautiful visual things for museums and for musical exhibitions. It was also all about corporate identity. So commercial graphic design, that's probably what made it took off in this country anyway. So a lot of big companies wanted a way to build trust and recognizability. And that's why they invented these design systems, and they wanted some kind of thing that would help them be recognizable across the board, sometimes across the world as well. So you could say these are design systems 1.0. One big example, and probably the first house style thing here in the Netherlands, was KLM. And as you can see, it has some recognizability problems. You can't recognize this when it's on a plane super far away. The illustration is super detailed, and the letters here that say KLM are actually quite hard to recognize. And hard to read. So it was redesigned by an American agency. They helped them with that, and they came up with this, which has a sans serif font. It's a whole lot easier to read and very recognizable. But it was still a little bit complex. So they researched this, and they found there's a whole lot of lines going on, and it's still a complex illustration that's going on here. So they refined it, and they made it like this. And this is kind of what we know today. This still exists without the stripes in the background. This is still what's happening. They did this broadly, so they introduced this new logo not just on the planes. They put it on napkins. They used it on signs everywhere around the world where they had offices and things. So it was used very, very widely. And this is probably one of the first big house style projects, and it inspired a movement here in the Netherlands because agencies figured out they could help big companies do this. And that happened. So after kind of the 60s, 70s, they started doing that. And Total Design, for example, is the agency that Wim Krouwel found, did all sorts of different work. So they worked for oil companies, but they also worked for the government. They made stamps, all these sorts of different things. And they were all modernist, and can see that all very like simple shapes and simple typography. Another agency called Tel Design worked on the NS house style, which was also in 1968. They came up with this, and it's still around. It was revolutionary at the time because they painted all the trains yellow, which is unique in the world. And I guess they had to convince a whole lot of people in the company to make that work. But at some point it got approved, and it's still around. So it wasn't just visuals, it was also other reasons for this whole modernist thing. So standardization of things like paper sizes made it a lot easier to do this cheaply and efficiently. Same for colors. You don't have to tell the printer what to mix with what. You can tell them to use this specific color type. So that was very helpful. And grids also helped. For example, if you have a form where you have the phone number in the same place on every single form, you can automatically process them. And that's something they started working on in those 60s, 70s. And I guess now that's all outdated, but that was something that helped at the time. So you could say that there was some sort of modernist graphic design revolution, and it was stuff like grids and neutral typefaces, mathematical proportions, and also function over form. That was something they found incredibly important. Now, not everyone was a big fan of this. That's something that is important to know. So this whole modernist stuff started happening everywhere, and it also caused things to sort of look the same everywhere. So notably, Piet Schreuders, who is here on the left, and that is Wim Krouwel on the right, he presented this essay, Lay in, Lay out, and if you read Dutch, I can recommend reading this. It goes completely against this whole modernist thing. He makes fun of his modernist colleagues because he thinks it's very like simple shapes, and you can deliver these designs by phone because they're so simple and so mundane. And there were more criticisms. So modernism takes the life out of everything. It's bad. So Piet Zwart, another super famous Dutch graphic designer, who said this. So not everyone liked this. And I guess the conclusion we could take out of that is that too much objectivity makes for boring layouts. And again, we've seen this happen on the web. I won't name names, but there are design frameworks that cause this stuff to happen. And we should probably only take the good things out of modernism. So for objectivity, I think we can use CSS. So if we do want to repeat stuff, I think CSS is awesome for that. That's kind of what I see my job as. So as a front-end dev, I write rules that help me take the design, and then I will make rules that make that design happen in browsers. Repeatable rules. Now, I do that without trying to take the life out of it. I want to make sure it is still lively in a way. So yeah, can we do this with CSS? And I guess you'll know the answer by now. We can definitely do that. So Mark Bolton wrote about this, where he wrote this blog post where he applied SQL's principles to the web. But this was in 2012, and at that time we didn't have a lot of layout tools that actually existed in browsers. We have a whole lot of new things now, that can actually help us do more interesting stuff in the browser. So some of these things, no, that's not true. I was going to say some of these things were shown yesterday. They were actually not, but I'm not going to talk about these particular properties and things that exist in CSS, because I will be focusing on layout modes in particular, because that's a brand new thing, and I think it's very exciting because it takes things into the browser that we really did not have before. So flexbox and grid. We can use them for things like equal heights. I remember many conversations with designers where they came up with something like this. So they are 3 beautiful cards that align very well together, and the reason for that is that they have exactly the same content. And of course, they are all the same height. But being kind of a realistic front-end developer, I would put some new content in that and make it sort of look like this. This is more realistic, but the designer would usually come back to me and say, it's not the same height, it doesn't start in the same place, this text. This is not what I meant. And then we had this conversation about like what the web should be like, because I feel like this is kind of how the web works. We can't change this. But sometimes we would end up doing a JavaScript-based solution to then make these things the same height and still make it work. Good news is we can do this stuff in CSS now. And the reason for that is this new layout mode called flexbox. So whenever you set display flex to something, it becomes a flex container. And at that point, you can use any kind of flex properties on it. So one example of that is align items. So for example, you can say, let all the items go to the top of this container. So the blue area is the container, the white areas are the items. Now the cool thing is the default of this is actually stretch. And the stretch will just make it as big as the container. And here we go, we have our equal heights without doing too much. This is the actual default. So if you set display flex to anything, you'll have your equal heights. Now something else that was important in this great graphic design thing is whitespace. And being able to intentionally apply whitespace. And that is something we can definitely do with these new layout tools. So one of the great articles I've read about doing design with grid layout, because grid layout is what's going to help us here, is by Wei Jing Chen. So she wrote this article called How to Design with CSS Grid. And in the article, she has this beautiful example of a design she was trying to create. It's the one on the left. And then she shows that she was actually sketching this stuff on paper. Might seem old-fashioned, but it's actually super useful. So she uses this to decide which parts of her design need to be flexible. Now I think it can also work really well if you're trying to decide where whitespace needs to go. So we have all these lines, and we can actually decide we are going to leave this part empty, and we're going to put content in this other part. So you can make intentional decisions about this, basically. So as you all know, if you put text into a browser, it will just fill up the window. This is the default stuff that happens in browsers. And there are some people who love this aesthetic. It's also been popular for a number of years. Wikipedia has had this for a long time. I'm not sure if it still has that. It's not very good for readability because these lines get really long and you don't know when you're on the next line or where the next line is. Kind of lose track. So it would be great to decide about whitespace when we have something like this. Now we can do this with grid layout. So we can design a grid like this. Chicold and Müller-Brockman would get angry if I would do this, but sure, I've made a quite boring layout just for the sake of example. So I've made 4 different columns that I want to put this content into. So in the HTML, it will be something like this. We have 4 paragraphs, and we have a div that goes around that. And in CSS, we'll just say display grid. And that turns it into a grid container. And at that point, we can now use grid properties, such as display, so the grid template columns. So with that, I'm saying I want 4 columns that are equal size. It's a very simple syntax, and it will create this virtual grid. When you create that, not much will happen, because you need to put stuff in. But you can also use autoplacement. That's what I'll show first. So because we had 4 paragraphs and we had 4 columns, this will automatically get placed into the columns. So each paragraph that is in here will be placed in the first available space. And because we have 4 of them, each of them get 1 paragraph in them. Now you'll probably want to put the paragraphs somewhere together, so you can group them into one element, put a div around them, and then that div will get automatically placed in the first available space, which is the first column. Now, at this point, we've not really made intentional choices because we've used auto placement, but we can make intentional choices because we can decide which column lines we want to use. So these lines, they all have numbers, and you can use them to place stuff onto the grid. So it works something like this. You say 2/4, and you put it in between line 2 and 4. And you can make other choices. So you can put it between 3 and 5, or you can make it slightly wider. This is not super creative. My point is, with grid, you can decide whatever you want to do with your white space and with your columns. It becomes as easy to fill stuff with content as to leave it empty. And that is an important point because that's what we need to do cool looking graphic design, I think. So yeah, let's just make intentional choices, basically. And that's not everything, because with this we can do compositions, which is cool. But composition on the web is a little bit more difficult than on paper. And the reason for that is with paper you know what your canvas is, and on the web people can scroll. So Vasilis Vergemen wrote this brilliant post about that. When you start scrolling, basically your composition changes. When you had this beautiful photo beautifully laid out and you start scrolling, it starts to look different. So yeah, I don't have a solution for that, but that's definitely something to take into account. Now, something else that we've seen these graphic designers do is use mathematical proportions. Or maybe just proportions, because they're all mathematical in a sense. So we can do that with flexbox. That's the default thing, so when you set something to display flex, it becomes a flex container, and we can now give these items a flex value. So in this case, I'm using a ratio of 2:1. That's just for the sake of example, and we can make this a whole lot more interesting by using different numbers. Same for grid layout. We can use different fractions, and then we get ratios in our grid layout without having to worry about how this works in the browser. So in old layout methods, we would need to think about percentages. So maybe with that first grid, you would have thought, oh, well, I can just do divs that are 25% of whatever the container is. But at that point, you are actually making up a percentage. And that is okay if you're dividing something by 4. But if you're doing this, it's a whole lot harder to decide what your percentages would need to be. And if I learned one thing from following CSS people on Twitter, the people who work on the specs in particular, it is that they hate percentages because they cause lots of weird bugs. The reason for that is that it's hard to know what a percentage is of. So what kind of container you are talking about when you say, I want this to be this percentage. There's more mathematics coming to your browser with ratios, so you can have white space between items and grids, and they will be a ratio between the rows and the column spacing. This is a really cool example of even more mathematics that we won't need to worry about. We just need to declare what we want, and the browser will do it for us, which is really cool, I think. So these great graphic designers, they made stuff proportionate to paper sizes, which was all quite cool. And I was wondering if we could do the same on the web. The problem is that we don't have standardized viewports. So the paper sizes were something like this. We had the A series. In America, they had different series. And on the web, we have this. And it's not going to work. If you've ever looked at your analytics for your website, you'll notice that you have multiple pages full of different resolutions that exist and that people use to go to your website. You cannot control this, and that's just going to happen. So the only thing you can do is make it proportionate not to a standardized viewport, but to any viewport. And that is something that CSS lets us do. We can do that with viewport units. So VW stands for viewport width, and then VH stands for viewport height. They're both numbers between 1 and 100, and they are basically a percentage of what your viewport is. Now you could make a grid with that, so you could say, I want to divide my page into 8 parts that are all a part of your viewport. And then you can position stuff onto that. And with that, you can have something that is sort of proportionate to your canvas. Now you can also put that in a browser, and it's quite nice if you look at this in the grid tools that exist in Firefox, because with that you can actually resize the grid and you can make it kind of work across viewports. And what you need to do here is make intentional choices. Again, because it's not going to work very well if you put content in this. You'll need to decide what you want to do at what breakpoint. Because at some point it becomes quite small. But the point is, this will be proportionate to your viewport, which is nice. You can have interesting visual effects if you do this. So one more thing that CSS will allow us to do is overlapping content. We could do this before if we set something to position absolute, but the problem with that is that it doesn't work with the available space. So your canvas won't grow with the text that is in there. And it will work if you do that in grid layouts. So if I have a photo, for example, and I put some content, what I can do is put the content into the same cells that the photo is in. I'll do something like this. And at this point, I can just use z-index to decide which part needs to go above the other. And that will just work. So you can assign numbers to that, and then you can decide which part needs to go above the other. And you can do that with a whole lot more complex things than this, and create creative things, basically. So these are some layout things. There are a whole lot more layout things that are already in browsers, and that sometimes some of them will come to browsers. We've seen a lot of masking and floats with shapes yesterday by Aga. It was a really cool talk. And there will be many more of these things coming to browsers, and it will become a whole lot easier to do layout on the web. So if we've seen all of this, can we say that we are ready for great graphic design? And the question that I was asked a lot when I was giving workshops about this is, will everything look the same in all browsers? That is a question that I have heard so much, because if you've ever been to a web conference in the last 10 years, that is something that comes up all the time. I would have thought that this would be something we wouldn't need to worry about anymore. I personally start to worry less about it, but when I talk to people who work for large companies, large corporations, they always have people in their teams that do not believe that this is an issue. So will everything look the same in every browser? My answer is that they don't need to, but in these large companies they will feel like they will have to. So they will ask the developers, for example, to make everything the same everywhere. And that is difficult. So I've drawn a little diagram of terrible layout on the one hand and then beautiful grid layout on the other. Now, of course you can have beautiful grid layout in almost all the browsers. So in Safari, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Samsung Internet, Opera, you'll just get your beautiful layout. That will actually work. But the problem is that in these large companies or in many kind of different environments, people will ask you to also make it work in all the other browsers, and that is not possible for various reasons. So you could try and create a polyfill using JavaScript, but the problem is that JavaScript runs in your browser. Your browser runs directly on the platform, but if you use JavaScript to do these mathematics for you, it will actually be a whole lot slower because it needs to run through the browser. It's not going to be as fast as your browser can do it for you. The other problem is that CSS is not extensible, at least not in the browsers that don't support grid layout. So extensibility is coming to CSS, which means that you'll be able to use JavaScript to influence how layout works in CSS using Houdini, but that is something that will only exist in the newer browser, so we can't actually take advantage of that. Now, it doesn't have to be a problem, because I think we can have this. We can have a simpler but pretty okay fallback, and that is something that needs communication, I suppose, more than technical solutions. So the technical solutions for this are plentiful. We have something like @supports, where you can detect if your browser supports grid layout. You can use floats, because built into the spec is that floats will not work when you're using grid layout, which is something you can use to your advantage, because you can just use fallbacks quite easily with floats. But that's the technical part. I think the more important part is the team part. So apparently it's difficult for some designers to do coding because the developers will complain that they've done code and it ends up in production. This is something we will need to talk about with our teams. We need to work together, otherwise we're not going to make this work. So experiment together. There's a great talk about this by Maaike de Laat, who is a designer. I think she used to be a front-end developer. And she complained to us front-enders at the Frontiers conference and said, we really need to experiment together, and front-end developers need to show designers what's possible on the web. And I guess that works the other way around. So designers should feel free to play with this stuff and come up with suggestions, basically. Just don't force developers to ship it to prod, because that's probably not what they would like. So yeah, it's about showing others the reality that we live in, because it is not possible to make everything look the same in all browsers. That's just a fact, that's not an opinion. And we just need to figure out how to have simple ways to deal with it. And the simple part is important here when you're working on fallbacks. I've seen that many people would like to make it as close as possible to each other. So when you try to create a fallback for a grid, to make something that is almost exactly the same. And I think we shouldn't try and do that because we are making it very difficult for ourselves and create some kind of maintainability nightmare. So my suggestion is simple fallbacks are a whole lot better. The only thing is we need to convince each other. So that's a communication thing that we'll need to do within teams. Yeah, that's about finding compromises, and that's what a whole lot of web design is about, as the wise Oliver Rijgenstein also said. So yeah, it's okay for these to be different. That's something I really want to stress, and I realize it's difficult if you work in a large company, or need to communicate really. So yeah, I think the web is ready for great graphic design. That is quite nice, I think. And the reason for that is that we can now do things in the browser that we couldn't do before. They are now built into browsers and we can now use them. That's all really nice. And one thing that Vasilis van Gemert asked me when I showed him these slides is that it's kind of boring because we're trying to copy modernism, but is that all there is to it if we just do what they used to do 40 years ago? Shouldn't we make stuff that inspires them so that they will think, wow, I've always been a graphic designer, but now I really want to work on the web because it does more interesting stuff than we could ever do. And that is going to be the large portion of my, talk. So how can we make the most out of this new era? And I think there are 4 different ways that we can do that, and they're all based on defaults. So there are all lots of different defaults that we can use to make things that are maybe better and kind of make it work better for people than print design ever possibly could. So that is flexibility. The web is flexible by default. It's also accessible by default. It's interactive by default, and it is based on web standards by default. And that is a huge advantage that we can use. And I'll show you how. So first off, the web is flexible by default. And I guess one of the go-to articles for that is John Alsop's post, A DAO of Web Design. It's all about letting go. And if you've not read this, it is the article that kind of sparked the whole responsive design movement. He talks about, we have this reality where, you know, everything is flexible and we need to accept that things are different in different places. So it's this kind of Zen thing, we need to let go, is what he uses, I think, in that article. And that's something we can see. So the print designers, they use canvases that are fixed. They know what the content is. I guess if you work at the newspaper, before you start designing an article, you actually know how many characters are going to be in that, because these people who write the articles actually get a word count. That's quite nice. Color options are available. They kind of have standards for that, more than we do. We don't have that. So our canvases are flexible, and we have no idea what canvas our users are going to have. Our content changes all the time because CMSs and other user-generated stuff. And options for colors are different everywhere. So people have different devices that they'll come to your website with. There's Kindles that display the web in black and white. It's fine, it works for those people. And there are also color differences between desktop browsers. If you open the same site in Firefox or Chrome, sometimes you'll see differences in colors as well. I think that's fine, but it's all about letting go. If we don't have that letting go mentality, we might get frustrated over all these details and then lose kind of sight of what's more important, and that is that people can do the tasks that they have come to your website for. So if they want to apply for a passport, they don't care that the color is different or weird, or that the layout is not with the beautiful proportions, that it has like slightly different white space. They wouldn't care, they just want a passport and get out of your website as soon as they can. So that's something to really keep in mind. Are we trying to optimize stuff that doesn't need optimizing? So if we embrace flexibility, we can work more effectively because we can focus on the right things. So yeah, we can do flexibility a lot on the web. So we can use flexible units like min-max. And I'll show you an example of that. So what if I had a grid where the left and the right column were one fraction, which means they get the leftover space, and the middle column is 50 ch. So that stands for characters. The reason that this thing exists, I think, is that a lot of typographers would tell you how many characters should be on one line to achieve good readability. So you can have a column that is super readable always, because it's always 50 characters wide. That's quite nice, but we can make this more flexible. So we can actually use min-max which takes 2 arguments, and what it will do is that it will make that column always be in between these values. The way that works is if you go to that website on a very small viewport, the browser will decide there's no space for 70 characters and it will give you 45. And that's all good. It will take into account what available space there is and make choices for you. And that's quite nice. If you leave that to the browser can decide for you. And they can make more informed choices than we ever can because they actually know what a canvas looks like. So you can leave these things to the browser. Now the web is also accessible by default. Very much so. And the reason for that is that it is mostly text. And that is a big advantage because we can select text and we can copy paste it to our friends. And we can have it read out by screen readers. So you don't need to record a recording of all the text on your website. You just present it as text and then a screen reader can read it out for you. It has that built in and the people that need this have screen readers already. So you don't need to worry about it. It will just work. You can enlarge it, so if you can't see very well, you can make it bigger. And you can put it into Google Translate, which is a nice advantage if you are reading a website that is in Chinese. So yeah, text lets us have accessibility automatically, and that is quite good. I was in Taiwan and I wanted to go to a cinema, and it had these beautiful menu buttons that were great graphic design, but they weren't text. So when I wanted to copy paste the menu items to put them into Google Translate, I asked my wife, how can I find tickets? I couldn't do that because I only had a picture and I couldn't copy paste these characters. And I have no idea how to type Chinese because it uses different keystrokes that my keyboard doesn't have. So that doesn't work for me. And if this would have been text, if they would have chosen to do this cool graphic design, or you can have opinions about that, but if you want this and you do it in text, people can actually have more advantages like copy pasting to Google Translate. Another example, this is a beautiful poster that exists in a book. But if you rebuilt it in HTML, which I did, then you can have these advantages of text. So when I turn off the CSS for this one, it will look like this. So we'll have a lot of text, and then we can have these advantages that text give us. So we can put it into Google Translate, or we can ask a screen reader to read this stuff out. Now this is just a simple poster. This also works for websites. So if you have a massively complex page that you have used good HTML for, and that's really a skill that is really important, I think, then you can have these advantages. So screen readers can actually make sense of this page and do good things for you, and you don't need to worry about them. So I've done this, and I've also done the translation thing because I could. And the cool thing is that the design kind of stands. Even though I've changed the content, it sort of still works. So there was a bit of overlap in the original, which is only in one of the translations. The others are a bit different. But again, we should probably let go and enjoy this beautiful design, and that we can now have more people enjoy this content. The way this also works is that grid cells will grow with the content that exists inside them. So if you've designed a grid and someone puts a whole lot of different content in there, it doesn't matter because the cells will actually grow. That is something you couldn't do when you design a poster for print. If you have too much content, it's just not going to fit. You can only make the font size smaller, and at that point people can't read it anymore. So yeah, text is better, I think, than images of text, and text on the web is really cool. I hope I've shown a couple of examples that really show that. Something else is that the web is also interactive by default, and that has many good advantages. For example, we can see where we are on the page. So if you're in a form, you can see which field you are currently on with the beautiful glow that's around these fields. You can see where you are. You can also hide and show stuff on demand, which again is something that you can't do if you do print work. You have to put all your content on the canvas, and you cannot make it hide and show on demand, and that's something you can do quite easily on the web. And you can use transitions. You can make stuff more pleasurable, perhaps. So someone has done this with some Swiss design posters, and they've kind of animated these things, put some transitions in, and made them look maybe more pleasurable than the originals. You can imagine these things were probably hanging in metro stations at the time. You can put them on screens in those same metro stations, and people might be more attracted by them. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is that the web is also built on web standards, and that's another advantage that we can use. So there were great print standards like paper sizes that are nice, but on the web we also have standards, and if we use them well, we can do a great job. I think it works really well if you understand the actual standard. So that's a point I really wanted to get across, because we, as an industry, we've kind of gone away from our standards and used abstractions on top of them, especially for layout. And there were good reasons for that, because layout wasn't really possible on the web, so we outsourced it to frameworks that would do it for us, so that we didn't need to worry about it anymore. Now that's something that has changed, because now on the web we can do that a whole lot better because we have these layout tools. So I've done another diagram between web standards and frameworks that abstract them. So for example, something like display flex. It's very useful to know exactly what these properties do, and you can find it out on the specification or on secondary websites like the Mozilla Developer Network, CSS Tricks. They explain how these actual things work. But what I've seen many people do is actually use abstractions on top of that, like mix-ins for Sass. So you can do something like include flex, and that will do your flexbox for you automatically. That's the promise. But I don't really know what that is. I know a fair bit about how flexbox works, but I don't really know what automatically doing my flex for me actually comes down to. I've looked that up. It sets a couple of defaults, which is quite weird. If you've learned how to use flex, then if you use an abstraction, it feels weird because you don't actually know what it's doing, and you cannot look it up in a specification because it's not standard. You cannot look it up on MDN because these things are just made by one group of people rather than by a whole consortium that the whole web sort of agreed about. So it's quite nice to stay closer to the web standard spectrum, and that goes even more if you look at frameworks like Bootstrap, it's an example of Bootstrap, and Suzy. So these were fantastic things when we had to do a layout, but they weren't built into the browser. But they aren't so great now that we have these tools, because they also come with disadvantages. The creator of Suzy was saying this a couple of weeks ago. I don't even use Suzy anymore. The reason C explained, C uses grid layout now for the same kinds of things. So it was a necessary thing to have at the time because people came up with interesting layouts. So maybe designers would tell developers, I want all these templates. So of course, people would use frameworks to make that work. But now, we probably don't need it anymore. Well, the same goes for Bootstrap. So it has 204 different unique class names that do your layout, but they also do the layout of many other people that are not in your site. That's a big thing because it's a lot of overhead. It doesn't only have too many class names, it also has too few class names because you can't do the proportions that you can do when you use grid layout. So, for example, if I had this column that was 3 and 2 and 1, that's a different equation that doesn't exist in Bootstrap. So you could actually replicate that. In Bootstrap, everything has to be 1 out of 12 or 2 out of 12 or 3 out of 12. It wouldn't have, for example, 4 out of 9. It can't do that. So it has too few and too many class names at the same time. So yeah, I would say probably choose vanilla. That's probably going to help a lot, but it is going to be a bit of work because understanding these actual things is a bit of a challenge, but there is good resources for that, especially MDN and CSS Tricks are very helpful with this. So I would recommend be around the web standards part, especially now. It made sense to not be there when we didn't have layout tools, but we now have them. A good way also to get started with things like CSS Grid is Jan Simmons' blog. She has a couple of examples that are ready to go and play with. There are also gamified versions of this, so you can put frogs onto a flexbox thing, or you can have your own garden and kind of move carrots around in the grid. It's quite nice and quite zen, and really helpful to learn all these properties, because there are a lot of properties in these new tools that you'll need to learn. So yeah, there are a whole lot of things that we can now do on the web, which is really nice. These are just examples of graphic designy things. There are a whole lot more different things we can try and do. But this is quite nice. We can do all these different things. And we can do them probably better than we could ever do when we're making print design, because we can make them flexible, accessible, interactive, and also standards-based. So these things are actually helpful. And I should stress it's not a competition between print and web. My hope really is that graphic designers will think, well, this is exciting, and come on to the web, because we can probably make better things that more people can enjoy. So it's definitely not a competition. I hope that people will work together a whole lot more. And that's kind of what I want to end with. It's a really good time to be working on graphic design and on layout on the web. And that's all for me. Oh, and the slides are Noticed. It's a new website, and it has also the resources and code pens and things. So it's Noticed/HTV. That's all for me.
Thank you so much. We've got time for a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we had a question asking what fallback do you suggest for IE, because that supports obviously doesn't work, but maybe you could explain like why that
so
works.
That support works in some versions of IE, which is nice, but you can also use floats because it's built into grid layout that floats don't work whenever you use grid layout. So that means when you use floats in a grid-based browser, they'll be ignored, and in browsers that don't understand grid, they will not be ignored. So then you can actually use that.
Cool. So we have a question from Rwanda.
Nice.
Are Flex and Grid facilitating accessibility? Does it give logical flow so that when you're reading the page with a screen reader, is everything read in the correct order?
Yeah, so they follow source order by default. So in one of the examples I showed, they automatically get placed according to their order in the source. But you can also change it around, especially with grid. So you can make things appear in places that don't match the source order and make it very difficult for people to follow it. So that's definitely something to take into account when you're using this. These things can be independent, and that can be annoying for accessibility, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Do you have any advice on when you should use grid and when you should use flexbox?
You should probably use them at the same time. So Flex is great for one-dimensional things. So if you're trying to align stuff on one line and dividing whitespace in that line, and if you want to have more lines that are horizontal and vertical at the same time, so they're two-dimensional, then it's easier to have grid because then you can do that. So it's one versus two-dimensional, I think.
Okay. And a final question from me. Is there any progress on subgrid?
Yes. Is being worked on, and I think they're also playing with it in nightly versions of browsers now. And there is some information about the syntax, what it might look like. So it's coming, but it's not there yet. There's display contents, which can sometimes cover some of the use cases, but that has some accessibility problems that are not solved in all browsers. So yeah, it's not great yet.
Is the provisional documentation for that on MDN?
I'm not sure. I know it's in the specification. I think it's probably not an MDN because it's not in browsers yet, but I wouldn't be sure about that.
So we should download Firefox and try it out.
Probably, yeah. That's a great thing anyway, if you're working on layout stuff, yeah.
Okay. Was that if you go to the Firefox download page, is it that, or do we need the developer edition to play with some of this new stuff?
newer grid tools, so if you want the latest and greatest, that is a good way to go. And it works separately from your regular Firefox, so you can have two copies at the same time running, which is quite nice.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, and let's give another round of applause.